carried two smells: salt, and something older, sweeter, wrath. Brother Ronan stepped from his coracle onto wet shingle and knew before he climbed the path. The gulls knew too. They were still feeding. No bell rang, no psalm rose from the cliffs. The convent of Innis Mayab had answered Rome for 60 years, and now it answered nothing. Ronan pulled his cowl close. His fingers found the wooden cross at his throat. He had been sent as an investigator. He understood now he had been sent as a gravedigger. The main gate hung in splinters, oak thick as a man's thigh, broken like kindling. Iron hinges torn from the stone. Inside the courtyard he walked across a carpet of ruin. Shards of clay, strips of vellum curled by rain, and bone. Small bone. White bone. The kind the birds leave behind when they have taken everything else. The chapel had no roof. Sea mist had drifted through the open beams for months, washing the floor, washing the walls. It had not washed the altar. The granite there was black. A black that had sunk into the stone and stayed. At the base of that altar, he found the first one. A girl. 20, perhaps less. Her habit still clung to her ribs in gray ribbons. Her skull lay turned upward. The jawbone had fallen open, and it had stayed open, locked in a shape Ronan would see in his dreams for the rest of his life. This was not a ruin. This was a confession, written in bone. The chronicles would later record a simple thing. In AD 795, on a small island off the Irish coast, 42 consecrated women were killed by the first Viking raiders to strike the Western Isles. A martyrdom. A holy tragedy. The chronicles lied. Brother Ronan's report, written by candle in a stone cell, would be sealed by the church and locked away for more than 1,000 years. His count was exact. 17 women died on the island. Their bones were left to the gulls. The other 25 met a fate the church judged worse than slaughter. A fate so shameful to Rome that the women themselves were scraped from the records. Their names burned. Their existence denied. Tell us in the comments which city and country you're watching from. And if you believe these buried stories deserve to be heard, take a second to subscribe. Stand what happened on the rock called Innis Mayab in the spring of AD 795. You have to first stand inside the world that existed there the morning before the ships came. It was not Ireland as you picture it. It was not even Europe as we understand it. It was a fortress of belief, perched on a slab of wind-burned stone 2 miles off the coast of what is now County Dublin, where 42 women had walked away from the noise of the mainland to live inside a single idea. That idea was that prayer, repeated in the right order at the right hours, formed a wall stronger than oak and harder than iron. They did not see their vows as words. They saw them as armor, stitched in heaven, worn in the flesh. They believed the Almighty stood at the door of their convent, the way a thane stands at the gate of his hall. And they believed it the way you believe the sun will rise tomorrow. The convent itself had been founded in the year 731 by a daughter of the Uí Néill, the royal clan that ruled much of Northern Ireland. Her name was Sister Abilene. She had given up a marriage to a king of Brega to live on that rock. By 795, her bones lay under a flat stone in the chapel floor, and the women who lived above those bones still spoke her name every Sunday before the gospel reading. Their hours were measured by the bell. Lauds before dawn, prime at sunrise, terce, sext, nun, vespers, compline. The rule they followed had been written by St. Columbanus more than a century before, copied by hand at Bangor, carried across the Irish Sea, and brought to the island in a leather satchel by Abilene herself. The Latin words rolled through the chapel like a tide, in and out, and the women moved with that tide, the way fish move with the current. Between the offices, they worked. They mended fishing nets for the islanders who left bread at the gate every Thursday. They tended a garden of cabbages and onions clawed from thin soil, sweetened with seaweed dragged up from the tide line. They ground barley on a quernstone whose top half had been carved with a small cross by Abilene's own hand. They washed wool in a wooden trough, fed by the convent's only freshwater spring. A spring the islanders called Tobar na Mban, the well of the women. And in one stone room with a single high window facing east, they made a book. At the heart of that room sat the abbess Brigid. She was 67 years old. She had taken the veil at 14. on the feast of St. Brendan in the year 742, and she had not set foot on the mainland since. Her knuckles were swollen into knots from a lifetime of damp Atlantic winters, and her shoulders had begun to curve forward like a hook, but her eyes were still clear, and her hand, when it held a quill, still moved without trembling. For more than 10 years, she had been building a gospel. It was her great work, her offering, the thing she would leave behind when her body went into the ground beside Ibeline's. Around her sat the youngest of the sisters, the ones she was teaching. There was Kawime, 16, the daughter of a fisherman from Howth, who had given his only girl to the church in thanks for a sail that did not tear. There was Fianuala, 19, a runaway from a forced marriage in Leinster, who had begged for sanctuary 3 winters before and had never spoken of her family since. There was Maeve, also 16, an orphan of the great cattle plague of 786, brought to the gate as a starving child of 7. They ground lapis lazuli, the blue stone carried by traders from the Sari Sang mines in what is now Afghanistan, all the way along the Silk Road, into Constantinople, onto Venetian ships, and finally, up the coast of Gaul, to a merchant in Nantes, who sold it for its weight in silver. They ground it into a powder finer than flour. They mixed it with egg white and water until the pigment glowed like a piece of the sky trapped in a clay dish. They rendered goose fat in a small iron pot over a peat fire. They boiled oak galls with iron filings until the liquid turned the color of dried blood. And that was their ink. They scraped calf skin with curved knives until the vellum was thin enough to let a candle's glow pass through. Then Bridget would lean in. Her hand would touch the page, and the word of God would appear there in long looping letters in the insular majuscule script, surrounded by knots that doubled back on themselves forever, by dragons swallowing their own tails, by the small painted faces of saints whose eyes were dotted with flakes of beaten gold, no bigger than a grain of salt. The book was not a book. It was a slow promise made to eternity. It would take 20,000 hours to finish. They were 11 years in. They thought they had decades more. They thought time itself belonged to them. The wider Ireland of that spring was a land of small kings and smaller wars. Donchad MacDonniall sat as High King at Tara, but his grip on the lesser kingdoms was thin. Cattle raids between the Uí Dunlinge of Leinster and the Uí Nail of the north filled the summer months. The church was the one institution that crossed every border. Bishops moved between rival kingdoms under safe conduct. Monasteries held the wealth of dynasties in their reliquaries. No Irish king in living memory had ever raised a hand against a religious house, because to do so was to invite excommunication and the silent refusal of every priest in the island to bless his cattle or bury his dead. That was the world the women of Inis Maov trusted. A world in which holy ground was holy ground. A world in which a wall of belief had never been tested by a hand from outside the Christian map. Now, turn your face north, across cold grey water, past the Hebrides, past the Faroes, to a coastline of granite and pine, where the soil ran thin over bedrock, and the growing season lasted barely 4 months. This was the world the dragon ships came from. The fjords of what would later be called Norway, specifically the long inlets around Hordaland and Rogaland, a country where a bad harvest meant a family ate its dogs in November, and its leather belts in February, a country where the second son of any farmer inherited nothing under the law of Odal, because the farmstead could not be divided. A country where a strong arm and a sharp axe were the only inheritance a father could reliably leave behind. The men who would soon step onto Inis Maov were not yet the Vikings of legend. They had not yet founded Dublin, which would not be raised on the Liffey until 841. They had not yet sailed up the Seine to besiege Paris under Ragnar in 845. They had not yet planted their banners in Iceland or set foot on the shores of Vinland. In AD 795, they were something simpler and more dangerous. They were hungry men with boats. Their first known strike on the Christian West had come only 2 years earlier, in June of 793, when a raiding band fell on the monastery of Lindisfarne off the Northumbrian coast. The chronicler, Alcuin of York, writing from the court of Charlemagne, recorded that letter with shaking ink. Never before has such terror appeared in Britain. He wrote to King Ethelred, "The heathens have poured out the blood of the saints around the altar." That letter had not yet reached Ireland. The women on Inis Maov did not know the word for what was coming. Their gods matched the lives they lived. Odin gave no comfort. He hung himself from the world tree Yggdrasil for 9 nights, pierced by his own spear, to steal the runes from the well of Mimir, and he expected his followers to bleed for what they wanted too. Thor did not bless the meek. He smashed the skulls of frost giants with a hammer called Mjolnir, and laughed about it afterward. Their afterlife had no green pastures. It had a hall called Valhalla, with a roof made of shields, where dead warriors drank mead from horns and fought, healed, and fought again, until the world ended in fire at Ragnarok. A religion of forgiveness was, to them, the religion of a beaten dog. When these men looked at the monasteries of the West, they saw something almost too easy to believe. Buildings stuffed with metal, chalices of gold, plates of hammered silver, reliquaries crusted with garnet and amber, books bound in covers heavier than a sword, and standing between all that wealth and a Norse axe. Nothing. No walls worth the name. No men trained to fight. Only women and men in robes who would kneel and pray when the blade came down. A god who could not defend his own treasure house was a god worth nothing. Taking what such a god owned was not a sin. It was a verdict. The man who led the 3 ships that beached on Innismayab that morning was named, according to a saga fragment preserved in the much later Landnámabók, Thorfinn Skullsplitter. He was 31 years old. He had sailed under his uncle at Lindisfarne and had come home that autumn with enough silver to buy a wife and a farm. He had spent the winter listening to other men talk about other monasteries. By the time the ice broke in his home fjord that March, he had 3 ships, 90 men, and a chart drawn by a Frisian trader who had once been blown off course and seen a small island with a stone tower west of the Irish coast. The morning came with fog, thick, salt-heavy fog that rolled in off the Atlantic and pressed against the convent walls like wet wool. It was the 17th of May, the feast of St. Paschasius. Sister Edamer was on watch that hour, walking the low perimeter wall with her rosary moving through her fingers. She was 22 years old. She had been on the island for 6 years. She saw nothing. She heard nothing. Sound did not travel through fog like that. It died inside it. What she saw first was not a ship. It was a shape, a long dark shape sliding through the white. Then a head at the end of that shape. A wooden head carved into the snarl of a beast, painted red and black, mouth open, teeth bared. Then a second shape behind it. Then a third. The drakars were built with shallow hulls, no more than 3 feet of draft, so they could ride the surf right onto the beach without dropping anchor, and they did. The keels hissed across the shingle. The bell in the chapel tower had just begun to toll lauds. Edamer opened her mouth to scream. An arrow took her in the throat before she finished drawing breath. The arrowhead was a simple iron leaf, fletched with gray lag goose feathers, the shaft of pine. She fell from the wall into the courtyard below, 15 feet down, and her rosary kept moving through her fingers for a few seconds after she stopped. Inside, the women were rising for prayer. They heard a sound none of them had ever heard. The sound of a felling axe biting into the convent gate, not the patient rhythm of a woodcutter. A faster sound, a wilder sound. 3 men swinging together. The oak cracked. The iron straps screamed as they tore away from the wood. The crossbeam, a length of ash thick as a man's waist, splintered. And then, with one final blow, the gate came down. What came through that gate was not what any of the women had pictured when they imagined danger. These were not bandits. These were not soldiers. These were taller men than the sisters had ever stood beside, fed on cod and reindeer and mutton fat since childhood, shoulders wide as a yoke, faces half buried in beards braided with bits of bone and iron rings, helmets shaped from single sheets of iron, rounded over the skull with simple nose guards, mail shirts that hung to the knee and rang softly with every step. They smelled of seawater and pine tar and old sweat, and the iron copper stink of blood that had dried into leather a long time ago. And they were screaming, a language none of the women understood. Old Norse, hard with consonants, throat deep. The chant of lauds, half begun in the chapel, broke apart against it, the way a candle goes out in a strong wind. The nuns ran, some toward the chapel, because the chapel was God's house, and God's house had always been safe. Some toward the dormitory, where they crawled under straw mattresses and pulled woolen blankets over their heads, the way a child hides from thunder. Some toward the kitchen, where they tried to bury themselves under sacks of barley flour stacked against the back wall. They had lived their whole adult lives inside a single rule, that obedience and faith would protect them. They had never been struck. They had never been chased. They had never seen a man's face decide to kill them. Now they saw it everywhere. In the chapel, 3 raiders kicked over the reliquary that held a finger bone of St. Patrick brought from Armagh by Ibeline in 731. The bone, yellowed and thin as a hazel twig, rolled across the flagstones and disappeared into a crack between the altar steps. They did not look for it. They wanted the silver box. One of them lifted the great processional cross from behind the altar. A cross of cast bronze plated in silver that had been carried in every Easter procession for 90 years, and weighed it in his palm like a butcher weighing a cut of meat. He grinned and dropped it into a sack of oiled hide. Sister Maeve held up the small wooden cross that hung around her neck. She had been taught from the age of 7 that the sign of the cross would turn back any evil. She thrust it toward the nearest raider and began to recite the prayer of Saint Michael. Sancte Michael Arcangele, defende nos in proelio. The raider did not even break stride. He swept her aside with the back of his hand, and her head struck the stone pillar behind her, and she did not get up. Sister Fionuala saw it happen from the doorway. She had hidden behind the wooden screen that separated the choir from the nave, and through a knot in the wood, she watched Maeve fall. 3 years before, Fionuala had run from a man twice her age, who had paid her father in cattle for the right to take her. She had run because she believed God would protect her. She watched Maeve's small body crumple at the foot of the pillar, and something inside her, the thing that had carried her across 2 kingdoms and onto a boat to this island, went quiet. It was in that moment that the truth began to seep into the minds of the women who were still standing. The truth was a cold thing. It was colder than the Atlantic in March. The prayers were not stopping the blades. The crosses were not turning the men back. The walls of belief that they had spent their entire adult lives building were not there. There had never been walls. There had only been words. And words do not stop iron. We are building something here that does not exist anywhere else on YouTube. A community of people who believe that the dark corners of history deserve light, not silence. If that sounds like you, if you feel the pull toward the stories the textbooks skipped, then I want to invite you into the inner circle of this channel. It is called The Lineage. Becoming a channel member is more than support. It is taking a seat at the table where these stories are built. Your membership is what allows us to dig into archives others ignore, to chase down sources others dismiss, to keep the lights on in the room where these scripts are written. In return, you get early access to videos before they go public, exclusive posts, and a place among the people who keep this mission alive. Click the join button under the video and take your place in the ranks. Inside the convent, the harvest had begun. That was the word the raiders used among themselves, yer, in their tongue. Harvest. They moved through the rooms in pairs, the way men move through a field of grain. One to cut, one to gather. They knew exactly what they were looking for, and they knew exactly how much time they had before the smoke would draw curious sails from the mainland 2 miles away. Thorfinn Skull Splitter himself shouldered open the door of the scriptorium. Abbess Brigid was still there. She had not run. She had walked to her work table, the way she walked there every morning, and she had placed both of her gnarled hands flat on the unfinished gospel, as if her body alone could protect 10 years of labor. Thorfinn stopped in the doorway. He looked at her. She looked at him. Neither of them spoke because they had no language in common. Then he crossed the room in 3 strides. He did not strike her. He simply lifted her aside by one arm, as a man lifts a chair, and set her down against the cold stone wall. Then he turned to the book. He saw the gold. He saw the lapis blue glowing in the morning light from the high window. He did not see the dragons or the saints or the looping Latin script. He saw weight. He saw value. He drew a knife from his belt, a single-edged seax with a bone handle wrapped in copper wire, and slid it under the golden cover. With one practiced motion, he pried the cover free from the binding. It went into his sack with a soft, heavy thud. Then he picked up the vellum pages. 11 years of work. 20,000 hours. The blue of mountains 9,000 miles away, and the gold of distant mines, and the steady hand of an old woman who had given her whole life to a single book. He turned them upside down and let them fall. They scattered across the stone floor like leaves in November. His comrades, coming in behind him, did not even look down. Their boots ground the gold leaf into the dirt. The painted faces of the saints disappeared under mud and seawater dripping from the men's cloaks. Brigid watched from the wall. She did not cry out. She did not weep. Something in her face had already gone somewhere far away, somewhere past the reach of any axe. Thorfinn turned back to her. He looked at her hands, the swollen knuckles, the thin wrists. He looked at her face, the lines, the gray hair under the white veil. He was calculating. He was deciding what she was worth on the slave block at Hedeby, where old women fetched 1/10 of what a young one did. Sometimes nothing at all. He had not yet decided, but 17 of her sisters were already dead in the courtyard, their blood pooling between the cobblestones the islanders had laid by hand 60 years before, and 25 of them were still alive, herded now into the chapel under the broken roof, their hands bound behind them with strips of their own torn habits. And what Thorfinn and his brothers would decide to do with those 25 in the next 4 hours was the thing the Church of Rome would spend the next 1,000 years pretending had never happened at all. The first explosion of violence inside the convent walls did not last long. Within an hour, it had cooled into something quieter, and quieter was worse. The raiders were not raging now. They were working. They moved through the stone rooms the way a crew of foresters moves through a stand of timber, marking, cutting, dragging. There was no shouting. There were orders given in short Norse syllables, grunts of effort, the steady clink of metal being thrown into hide sacks. The convent of Innis Mayob was no longer a house of prayer. It was a warehouse being emptied. The men knew their trade. 2 years of practice on the Northumbrian coast, since the strike on Lindisfarne on the 8th of June, 793. Raids on the monastery of Jarrow in 794. A strike that same autumn on the small chapel at Iona's daughter house on Tiree. Hermitages along the Firth of Clyde, stripped one by one in the spring of 795. Thorfinn's crew had learned exactly how to empty a religious house in under 4 hours, and they had learned it from the men who had taught them. A silver chalice was not a chalice. It was 4 ounces of metal. They poured the communion wine onto the flagstones, where it pooled and ran toward the cracks between the slabs that Aibileen had laid herself in 7 boot, because a flat cup packs into a sack, and a round one came down in long shrieks of tearing wool. The one above the choir showed the calling of St. Andrew, woven over 3 winters by Aibileen in the years before her death. Gold thread ran through the water at Andrew's feet, thread spun in Byzantium and traded north through the Frankish ports of Quentovic and Dorestad. The raiders did not look at Andrew. They bundled the tapestry, knotted it, and threw it onto the pile. Later, in the long winter nights at home in Hordaland, women would burn the wool in clay dishes and skim the molten gold from the bottom. In the scriptorium, they ignored the parchment rolls of scripture and commentary, the works of Jerome and Augustine copied in Bangor and brought across the sea in oilskin wrappings. Those things had no buyer in Kaupang or Hedeby. What they took were the small sealed clay pots, the lapis lazuli, ounce for ounce more valuable than silver on the Khazar trade roads. The orpiment, the yellow pigment ground from arsenic ore, mined in the Cappadocian mountains. The vermilion, distilled from cinnabar, carried up from Almaden in Iberia. Into leather pouches it all went, sealed with beeswax, packed into wooden chests they had carried up from the ships for exactly this purpose. They smashed open the reliquaries with the pommels of their sea axes. The finger bones, the chips of skull, the strands of saintly hair preserved in tubes of glass, blown in Damascus. All of it spilled onto the floor and was left there. The boxes went into the sacks. The bones of the saints were trodden under nailed boots. In a smaller side chamber off the scriptorium, the raiders found something they had not expected. A wooden press. Inside the press, 23 smaller books, the working library of the convent. Psalters, a copy of the Rule of Columbanus, a penitential, a handbook of computers for calculating Easter, used by every monastery in the Western world since the Synod of Whitby in 664. The Norse had no use for these. They tossed them onto the floor in a pile, and one of them urinated on it before they walked out. The pile would still be there, sour and unburned, when Brother Ronan arrived 11 months later. By the 3rd hour, the stripping was done. What had been the wealth of a century lay folded and packed in 9 sacks and 3 small chests, ready to be carried down the path to the beach. And then began the second part of the work. A horn sounded in the courtyard, 2 short blasts on a cow horn fitted with a bronze mouthpiece. Thorfinn's skull splitter, blood-flecked but calm, stood at the broken well in the center of the yard, with his arms folded across his mail. The well was the one Aibileen